Picture the scene. You've got yourself a classic car and you adore it. It's your pride and joy. You've done it up exactly the way you like it. Lovely. But you're not going to want to daily drive it, are you? You don't want it down the shops with people bumping trolleys and swinging their doors into it. You don't want to daily drive it on potholed, speed bumped roads, and you don't want to risk it being written off in a crash just driving to and from work. But you also don't want to daily drive some boring modern diesel SUV, do you? So what you need is a compromise, something that's cheap to buy and cheap to run so you can pour more money into your pride and joy, something that is usable on the daily grind, but also not something so new you're going to be bored to tears every time you drive it. Well, for all those criteria, we've got the car for you. The often and frankly unfairly overlooked Mk3 Volkswagen Golf. The Mk3 Golf really does tick all of our criteria. It's cheap, it's old school, and it's a very much usable and practical daily driver. Now, if you fancy yourself an old school Mk3 Golf like this one, there are a few things you need to look out for. But worry not, because welcome to the classics world, Mk3 Golf Buyer's Guide. Engine-wise, the Mk3 Golf was eclectic. The 1.4 and 1.6 petrol are basic, solid, dependable units, but the 1.4 only has 59 horsepower, and when you think about the amount of weight this carries over the Mark II, that is quite a lot to be pulling around with not much power, so check for any signs that the engine's been overworked, quiz the seller about the service history, and make sure that at no point has it overheated. The 16-valve GTIs can suffer from a stumbly idle. They might not rev up quite right, they might hold revs too high. That points to a failed idle stabilisation valve, and it is fairly common on the 16-valve 2-litre GTI engines. The diesels, meanwhile, are the vulnerable VAG 1.9-litre diesel unit. The turbo units are equally tough, but if you are buying, as with any turbo car, make sure that all the pipe work, all the intercooler hoses, everything like that are in good condition, because if they blow off, it's a nightmare to get sorted. The gearboxes too are really tough and durable. Just make sure that whether it's an auto or a manual, there's no sign of any bearing noises, because you don't want to be taking apart your car immediately after you've bought it. Up and above the GTI was the 2.8 and later 2.9-litre V6 powered Golf VR6, and it is a lovely unit. However, the VR6 is an expensive unit to maintain. Coil packs are common to fail, and once you start replacing 3 or 4, that ain't cheap. And if you hear any signs of cam chain rattle, that generally means that the chain and the tensioners are going to need to be replaced. If you do it professionally, that's about 800 quid. The Mk3 Golf gained around 100 kilos over the Mark II, which of course does put extra stress on the suspension, but Volkswagen nicely updated it to make it compliant, comfy, and surprisingly planted in the bends as well, even in a relatively basic model. The shocks are pretty much expected to give up at 80,000 miles, but luckily these are a common and well-liked enough car that replacements are common and cheap. If you want to update the handling nicely, you could even look into some aftermarket adjustable coilovers to lower the car's ride height a bit and to make it even sharper in the bends. A vague rear end on a Mk3 Golf indicates that the rear axle bushes are deteriorated, and on a car of around 20-25 years old, that's pretty much expected by now. That said, the replacements are cheap and easy to come by, and replacing all the suspension bushes on a car of this vintage can make it feel brand new again. In terms of brakes, the GTI and the VR6 were the only models that came as standard with ABS, but it was an option right the way back to the basic model. If your car that you're looking at has got ABS equipped, turn it on, make sure the light comes on and goes off as appropriate, and when you're driving, try a few emergency stops to make sure that it's working properly. The GTI and VR6 were also the only models to come with all-round disc brakes, but earlier cars do actually use Mark II Golf rear calipers. These calipers are known to seize up if the car's been standing for a while or in particularly cold temperatures. But if that is an issue on the car you're looking at, fear not. Replacement parts from somewhere like VW Heritage are just 60 quid a side. Anyone familiar with classic dubs will tell you the #1 thing with the bodywork to watch is rust, and indeed the Mark III Golf is no more immune from tin worm than any other Volkswagen. Places to watch include the tailgate. Now, it's not a huge issue because it is a replaceable part, but it's worth bearing in mind that if it rusts particularly badly, it might leak, and people might even be able to gain access to your boot if they try hard enough. Replacement tailgates, again, are cheap and easy to find, but make sure the replacement one you're looking at doesn't have any signs of rust starting on it either. Other places for rot are around the front. Check the windscreen frame and the bottom of the front wings. For the Mark III Golf, Volkswagen added these lovely plastic arch extensions, and they genuinely do a good job of improving the styling. Because of how they're attached to the body, they're a very common trap for moisture. Water kind of sits in here and it rots the wing from within. If you're going to look at a Mark III Golf, bring a magnet with you, or at the very least, just feel inside the arches for any signs of water having been trapped and rotted them away. If the front ones have got some tin worm, that's okay, it's replaceable, but if the rears are rusty, you better get the welder out. They can rot on the sills as well, so once again, get your hands underneath and see if you can even just feel or hear for any signs that the metal underneath isn't as solid as you'd like it to be. In the engine bay, the strut tops can rot as well, and that's a big job to sort out, and the battery trays are common to rust as well. It's worth bearing in mind that on a classic car that's worth 5, 10, 15 grand, rust repair to this extent is justifiable, but on a car like the Mark III Golf, where you can pick them up so cheaply, rust repair is complex, expensive, and time-consuming. So if you've got a car where these rust areas are starting to mount up, it can very quickly financially write the car off. Other areas to check for rot include the rear floors, and also check in the boot floor, particularly if you've got a rusty tailgate that might have leaked at some point. It could be very easy for water ingress to have got into the carpet, soaked it in, and gradually rotted your floors out. But in this one, I think we're solid. Panel gaps should be good all the way round, and as for the door hinges, well, given the propensity for rust up the front, make sure that when you open the door, it doesn't drop, because if it does, that might indicate A-pillar damage or indeed rot from within. When you shut the doors, just check. Sounds just like a Golf. The Mark III Golf's interior was criticised for being a bit boring and plain compared to the Mark II, but what that means today as a daily driver in the real world is a car that's much more refined, comfortable and usable long distance than any Mark II Golf ever was. But if you are going to be buying a Mark III, this lovely refined interior does have some spots to look out for. On the sportier Mark III Golfs, you get these lovely sports seats, but because they've got bigger, wider, more pronounced bolsters, it's very easy for them to be worn away over time. But with that said, they're easy and cheap to track down replacements. Generally, the biggest problem you'll find with Volkswagens of this era are the little fiddly bits. Bits like glove box catches. Our own Jeff had to replace this glove box catch when it completely fell apart and wouldn't keep the glove box shut. 90s hot hatches are also common to have been stolen back in the day, so if you're looking at a GTI, chances are it will have some sort of immobiliser fitted to it. If it does, make sure it works. Get any codes or any combinations you need off the seller, because if you don't, and if you have any issues with it, it might render your car unusable in certain circumstances. As with most 90s German cars, the Mark III Golf does suffer with some problems with electrics. For example, electric door mirrors. They are standard fitment on the higher spec models, but make sure they work as they should. For example, on this car, they do work, but little bit slow these days. And then there's electric windows. These are a common failure point on Mark III and Mark IV Golfs for the winders and the regulators. Now you can get replacements brand new or second-hand, or if you're a bit more DIY inclined, you can even get rebuild kits for your existing ones. What you want to do is make sure they go up and down quickly, smoothly, and without making any untoward noises, which this one does. So that's everything to look out for if you're looking to buy yourself a Mark III Volkswagen Golf. But with all that in mind, which one should you go for? If you fancy a petrol-powered car, it makes sense to go for the GTI because frankly, it is the fastest, you'll still get well over 30 mpg on a run, and it's the most fun with the best performance. Diesel-wise, if you are going to go for a black pump car, you want the turbo diesel because the non-turbo cars are frankly glacial in performance and they're too slow to be viable on today's modern motorways. VR6s, of course, are a lovely car to drive, but if you're buying on a budget, they're just not worth the risk. You can get some under 1500 quid, but the maintenance will be ruinous if and when anything goes wrong on them. Which brings us nicely onto the cost. Mark III Golfs are old enough to be a cool retro daily, but they're not quite into classic territory yet. And what that means is that they are a bargain second hand. You can get yourself a serviceable Mark III Golf in most guises for about 300 or 400 quid. And if you want to go up the ranks a bit to around £1,000, you can potentially get a really nice one. Our own Jeff bought this Mark III GTI 8 valve for just 500 quid. And you know what? I think it's worth every penny of that. But heed this advice, look carefully and buy well, and what you've got in the Mark III Volkswagen Golf is a cheap, comfortable, economical, practical and alternative retro daily without the need to drive a diesel SUV. And with that said, time for golf, I reckon.